James Carter stood in line at the check-in counter, feeling a little out of place in the busy airport. At just 17, he wasn't used to traveling alone, especially on a first-class flight. He wore a simple hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. Nothing. That stood out. His clothes were comfortable, but they didn't scream wealth. In fact, they were just ordinary, like any teenager's clothes. He held a first-class ticket in his hand. He had been given the ticket by his father's lawyer after his father's sudden passing. James didn't know much about business, or what being the heir to his father's company meant. He just knew that he was flying to New York for a meeting with the board of directors. His heart was heavy with grief, but also filled with a sense of responsibility that he wasn't sure he was ready for. James stood quietly, watching the other passengers in line. They were dressed well, most of them in suits or fancy dresses, while he stuck out with his simple, worn-out hoodie. He didn't mind. His mother had always taught him not to care about appearances, to focus on what really mattered inside. But still, there was that uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. He couldn't shake the thought that maybe people would judge him for looking so ordinary. When it was finally his turn to board, James stepped forward, ticket in hand. He was ready to get on the plane, escape the stares of the crowded terminal, and find some peace up in the air. That's when it happened. A flight attendant named Linda stood at the gate, looking him up and down with a raised eyebrow. She was in her mid-40s, with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. James could feel her gaze on him before she even spoke. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked loudly enough for others to hear. "This is first class, not economy." The word stung, and James felt his face flush. He wasn't used to being treated like this, especially not by someone in a uniform. The other passengers turned their heads, some of them glancing at him with raised eyebrows. James took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Yes," he replied quietly, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I'm in the right line." Linda didn't seem convinced. She looked at him for a moment longer, her expression skeptical. After a few awkward seconds, she finally glanced at his ticket and waved him through. "Fine, go ahead," she said, clearly unimpressed. James moved forward, his heart racing. He couldn't help but wonder if people were really seeing him or just judging him for what he wore. Did Linda think he didn't belong in first class? Did the other passengers think the same thing? He didn't know why he cared so much, but he did. As he made his way onto the plane, James tried to focus on the fact that he was going to New York to take care of important business. But all he could think about was Linda's dismissive look and the whispering of the other passengers. He wasn't sure if it was his clothes or his age that made people doubt him. Maybe it was both. Once he was seated, he looked around the first-class cabin. The other passengers were chatting quietly, reading books or working on their laptops. No one seemed to notice him, which was a relief. James settled into his seat, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. But Linda wasn't done with him yet. She came around with the drink cart, stopping in front of James. She handed him a glass of water without a word, barely meeting his eyes. It wasn't a surprise, but it still stung. As she moved on to the next row, James could hear her mutter something under her breath, though he couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to hear them to know that they weren't kind. The entire flight seemed to drag on. James couldn't stop thinking about Linda's attitude. Every time she passed by, he felt a small wave of tension rise in his chest. She would glance at him, then look away as if he wasn't even there. He wondered if he would ever be able to shake the feeling that people were always judging him for his appearance. It wasn't that James didn't understand why people judged others by how they looked. He knew it happened all the time. But his mother had always taught him to ignore those judgments, to keep his head up and stay true to who he was. Yet in moments like this, when people's eyes seemed to weigh him down, it was hard to remember that lesson. The plane flew on, cutting through the clouds and heading toward New York. James looked out of the window, his thoughts drifting. He missed his mother more than ever. She had always been the one to remind him that he was more than what others saw on the outside. She'd told him that his worth was in his character, in his kindness, and in how he treated others. But it was hard to hold on to those thoughts when he felt so small. Linda's words, her cold stare, and the quiet judgment from the other passengers all piled up in his mind, making him question whether his mother's lessons were enough to protect him from the world. James closed his eyes, trying to push the Thoughts away. He didn't want to let this moment define him. He wanted to be stronger than the judgments of others, to rise above them. But the hurt still lingered, sharp and real. As the plane flew on, James took a deep breath and reminded himself of one thing. He wasn't just the clothes he wore or the way people saw him. He was James Carter, and he had a future ahead of him, one that was his to shape no matter how others looked at him. The world might judge him by what they saw, but that didn't mean he had to believe it. The flight was far from over, but James was determined to make it through, no matter what. And in that moment, he promised himself that he wouldn't let the world's judgments hold him back. The end James sat back in his seat, trying to settle into the comfort of the first-class cabin, but the tension in the air made it hard. The soft hum of the plane and the low chatter of the other passengers only reminded him that he didn't belong here, not in the way they did, at least. Everyone around him seemed to fit the picture of success. They wore expensive suits and smiled easily, their lives looking put together. James couldn't help but feel out of place. Linda, the flight attendant, passed by his seat again, this time with a cart full of food and drinks. She stopped in front of him, giving him a quick glance before moving slowly, as if she were purposely taking her time. She handed drinks to the other passengers quickly, but when it was his turn, she barely looked at him, taking extra time to pour his water and hand it to him without a word. It was as if she were making sure that everyone knew she was giving him the bare minimum. He didn't understand why she was treating him this way. He hadn't done anything to her. As he sat there trying to ignore the tension building in his chest, his mind wandered. He remembered his mother. She had raised him alone after his father walked out of their lives. She had worked hard, always putting James first, teaching him values that would stay with him forever. She never cared about money or appearances. She believed that kindness, humility, and inner strength were what made a person truly rich, and she made sure James knew that. When James was young, he had always wondered why his mother never seemed to care about the things that other kids' parents cared about. While other families talked about the best cars or vacations, his mother focused on teaching him how to treat people with respect, even when they didn't treat him the same way. She taught him that no matter what anyone thought of him, he was enough just as he was. She told him that the world would judge him, but that his character would be his strength. James thought of her often, especially in moments like this. He missed her more than anything. She had passed away last year, leaving him with a heavy heart and an even heavier responsibility. After her death, he found out that his father had left behind a huge company, a business empire worth millions. It was all his now, even though he hadn't heard from his father in years. But James didn't care about the wealth or the power. What mattered to him was living up to the example his mother had set. She had always told him to stay humble, to remember that his worth was not tied to his possessions or his status. Now, he was on his way to New York, headed to a meeting with the board of directors for the company his father had left behind. The thought of it made him anxious. He didn't want to be there, not because he didn't care about the company, but because he didn't know how to be the person they all expected him to be. He wasn't ready to take over such a massive business, and he certainly didn't want to be treated differently because of it. The thought of the meeting felt like a weight on his chest. He didn't talk about the company much, mostly because he didn't want to draw attention to it. People often looked at him differently when they found out who he was. They expected him to act a certain way, like he had everything figured out. But he didn't. He wasn't sure he could live up to the expectations of the board or anyone, for that matter. Linda returned with her cart once more, this time serving the other passengers before coming to him. She smiled at them, asking if they needed anything, her tone warm and friendly. But when she reached James, it was as if he was invisible. She handed him his meal without a word, her expression stiff, and moved on quickly to the next row. James couldn't understand why she was treating him like this. He hadn't asked for special treatment. All he wanted was to get to New York in peace and figure out what he was supposed to do next. As he looked around the cabin, the feeling of being judged grew stronger. People were whispering to each other, glancing his way, then turning their attention back to their own conversations. He could feel their eyes on him, not because of who he was, but because of what he wore. They didn't know his story, but they had already made up their minds about him. It was as if his hoodie and jeans were enough to tell them everything they needed to know. The weight of their judgment was starting to get to him. It wasn't just the passengers or Linda, it was the whole situation. James felt like he was carrying the weight of everyone's expectations, the grief of losing his mother, and the pressure of a future he wasn't sure he was ready for. He didn't want to prove anything to anyone, but in moments like this it felt like he had to. He wanted to show them that he was more than just a kid in a hoodie, more than just the heir to a company he didn't know how to run. But how could he show them when they wouldn't even see him for who he really was? He wasn't the clothes he wore or the seat he was sitting in. He was just James, a young man trying to figure out where he belonged in a world that seemed to expect him to have all the answers. He closed his eyes and thought of his mother again. She would have told him to ignore the judgment, to rise above it. She would have reminded him that the only thing that mattered was the kind of person he was. He wasn't his clothes. He wasn't the company he was about to inherit. He was James, Carter, and he had the power to define who he was no matter what anyone else thought. James sighed and looked out the window, watching the clouds pass by beneath the plane. He couldn't control what people thought of him, but he could control how he responded. Maybe that was enough. For now, it would have to be. The end as the flight continued, James couldn't shake the feeling that Linda was watching him closely. The coldness in her treatment didn't let up. When the food cart came around again, she served the other passengers first, offering them smiles and small talk. But when it came to James, she was quick and dismissive. She handed him a tray with his meal, her eyes barely meeting his. The silence between them felt thick, like she was purposefully ignoring him. James didn't understand why Linda was so distant. He hadn't said anything to her, hadn't done anything to deserve her cold attitude. He simply wanted to get to New York and focus on what was ahead of him. But with every passing moment, the tension between them seemed to grow. It was as if she had made up her mind about him, without even knowing who he really was. The other passengers continued on with their flights, reading, sleeping, or chatting quietly. But James couldn't relax. He kept his head down, trying to avoid drawing attention. The last thing he wanted was to be noticed for the wrong reasons. But it wasn't easy. He could feel the stares, the whispers, the judgment. Even though he sat in first class, it felt like he was still an outsider, as if he didn't belong there. The man sitting next to him, an elderly man with grey hair and glasses, had noticed the tension too. After a while, he turned to James with a warm smile. "You okay, son?" the man asked, his voice gentle. James nodded, trying to keep the conversation light. "Yeah, just a little tired," he said, offering a small smile back. The man's eyes twinkled with curiosity. "I don't mean to pry, but where are you headed?" James hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to explain everything to a stranger, but he also didn't want to be rude. "I'm going to New York for a business meeting," he said quietly, hoping that would be the end of it. Mr. Thompson, the elderly man, raised an eyebrow. "Business, huh? What kind of business?" James sighed, looking out the window for a second before answering. "It's about my father's company. I'm the new CEO." The words felt heavy, almost like they didn't belong to him. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to be the person everyone expected him to be. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he felt a shift in the air. The elderly man's eyes widened, and he leaned back in his seat, clearly surprised. "Wait a minute," Mr. Thompson said, his voice rising in disbelief. "Did you just say Carter Enterprises?" James nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's the one." Mr. Thompson's mouth dropped open slightly, and he looked at James with a new sense of respect. "I can't believe it," he murmured, shaking his head in amazement. "Carter Enterprises, that's one of the biggest tech companies in the world. You're telling me you're the CEO now?" James didn't know how to respond. The man's reaction was so different from the cold treatment he had been getting from Linda and the others. For a second, it almost felt like the world had shifted. The whispers from the other passengers around them started to rise as people leaned in, clearly curious about what had just been revealed. "Wow, I had no idea," Mr. Thompson said, still clearly in shock. "You're a big deal, huh?" James just shrugged, feeling uncomfortable. He wasn't proud of being the CEO. He didn't feel like a big deal. He was just trying to make it through the day without making any more mistakes. "I guess," he said, keeping his voice as neutral as possible. "It's a lot to take in." By now, the entire cabin seemed to have caught wind of the conversation. People were whispering to each other, some casting quick glances at James. The air felt charged now, full of curiosity and surprise. James could feel the shift in the way they looked at him. It was like the moment he spoke those words, the way people saw him had changed. Before, they had seen him as just another teenager in a hoodie, someone who didn't belong in first class, someone who didn't fit in. But now he wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was James Carter, the heir to a massive company, the new CEO of one of the most famous tech empires in the world. The whispers grew louder, and James felt the weight of their attention. It wasn't that he wanted to be the center of attention. Far from it. He never asked for any of this. But now the judgment from before seemed to fade away. People weren't looking at him like he was out of place. They were looking at him with awe, with respect, and maybe even envy. The coldness from Linda, the flight attendant, hadn't disappeared, but it felt less important now. It wasn't about what she thought. It was about what everyone else thought. Mr. Thompson chuckled lightly. "Well, I guess I'm sitting next to a future billionaire." He smiled warmly at James, his face kind, not judgmental. James smiled back, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not sure about that," he said, his voice quiet. "I'm just trying to do what's right." The news spread quickly. By the time the plane was halfway to New York, James was no longer the kid in the hoodie. He was the new CEO of Carter Enterprises, and the whispers in the cabin were louder now, tinged with respect and awe. Some of the passengers even gave him nods of acknowledgement, as if they now saw him for who he truly was. But despite the change in how people viewed him, James didn't feel any different. He wasn't the wealthy CEO. He wasn't the heir to an empire. He was just a young man trying to live up to the expectations set by a father he barely knew and a mother he had lost too soon. And that weight, the weight of being someone he didn't know how to be, still sat heavily on his shoulders. But for now at least the whispers had stopped being judgmental. For now he was just James Carter, and that was a small, quiet victory in itself. The end. As the plane began its descent into New York City, James sat by the window, watching the skyline grow larger and larger. The city was just as he remembered, bustling, busy, and full of possibilities. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't just a teenager going to a meeting. He was the new CEO of Carter Enterprises, and the weight of that role was heavy on his shoulders. The cabin had transformed since the moment the news about his identity had spread. Passengers, who had once ignored him or judged him for his hoodie and jeans, now looked at him with a mix of awe and curiosity. Some gave him nods of respect, while others stole glances when they thought he wasn't looking. James could feel the change in the atmosphere, the shift from judgment to reverence, but he didn't care about the attention. It wasn't about that. As the plane touched down and began to taxi to the gate, James gathered his things, preparing to disembark. The noise of the engines and the movement of the plane did nothing to quiet the buzz of his mind. He was about to step into a world that was full of expectations, expectations that felt suffocating, but also like an opportunity. The moment the plane stopped, the door opened, and James stood to leave. As he walked down the aisle, he felt the eyes of every passenger on him. They didn't speak, but their gazes followed him as if they were waiting for something. James kept his head held high, not looking at anyone. He didn't need to prove anything to them anymore. When he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the sight before him took him by surprise. A group of reporters was standing near the gate, cameras at the ready, their flashes blinding. A few security personnel were there too, looking serious and prepared. They were all waiting for him. James took a deep breath, his heart racing. He had never liked attention. He had never been the type to want to stand in front of a camera. But today he had no choice. He was the heir to Carter Enterprises, and the world would know him now. The reporters quickly gathered around him, their voices rising in a cacophony of questions. James didn't say a word at first. He just walked through the crowd with quiet dignity, his steps calm and steady. He had learned over the years that it wasn't about the noise. It was about how you handled it. As he made his way through the group of reporters, one of them managed to get close enough to ask a question. A young woman with a microphone in hand called out, "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to be judged for your appearance?" James paused for a moment. The question caught him off guard. He had been judged his whole life for how he looked, by strangers, by people on the plane, by even the people in this room. But he wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt anymore. He had learned through his mother's teachings that judgment wasn't something to carry. He turned to face the reporter, his eyes calm and his voice even. "People judge you by what they see on the outside," he said, his words measured and gentle, "but they never know your heart. I've learned to focus on what really matters. Kindness, humility, and what you give to the world." The words weren't just for the reporter. They were for everyone in the room, for the passengers on the plane, and for Linda, who was standing at a distance, watching it all unfold. James could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The moment wasn't about her, it was about the message. It was about showing the world that he wasn't what they thought he was. He was more than just a kid in a hoodie. The reporter nodded, clearly impressed by his calmness. "So you're saying that appearances don't matter?" James shook his head slightly, his gaze steady. "No, appearances don't matter. It's what's inside that counts. I've learned that no matter what people see, they don't know your true story. They don't know what you've been through or what you've had to overcome." The camera flashes continued, but James barely noticed them. He wasn't there to be a spectacle. He was there to share a lesson, one that he had learned the hard way. He had spent so much of his life worried about how others saw him. But now, he understood that none of that mattered. He was not defined by what people thought of him. He was defined by his actions, by how he treated others, and by the values he held. As the reporters continued to ask their questions, James walked toward the exit, surrounded by the noise and the flashes. But he felt calm. It was strange, but it was true. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to prove himself. The world could think whatever it wanted. He knew who he was, and that was enough. Linda stood at the back of the crowd, watching James as he walked past her. She had seen him on the plane with his simple hoodie and quiet demeanor, and had judged him without knowing who he really was. She had mocked him in her mind, thinking he didn't belong in first class, thinking he was just another teenager trying to pretend he fit in. But now, as she watched him walk with quiet confidence, she realized the truth. He wasn't just another kid. He was James Carter, the heir to a $900 million empire. The person she had dismissed was someone who could change the world, but James didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He had already proven everything he needed to prove. The quiet dignity in his step, the grace in his words, and the wisdom in his heart spoke louder than any judgment could ever have. As he walked out of the airport and into the world that awaited him, James carried with him the lesson he had learned long ago, that no matter what anyone thought of him, he would always define who he was, and that was the greatest victory of all. The end.